While I was giving her mom my kidney, she showed up with another man. He lay on the operating table believing he was doing the most noble thing for his family. His mother-in-law needed a kidney, and he was the only one who could save her. But just a few days after surgery, when he could barely stand up, the hospital room door swung open. His wife walked in hand with another man. His chest tightened, not from the surgical incision, but from the cold look in her eyes. They thought everything was over right there. But there was a truth they had no idea about. And when that truth came to light, everything they believed was solid began to crumble, piece by piece. Before we dive back in, take a quick second, subscribe so you don't miss the next twist. Hit like if you're hooked, and comment where you're watching from. Houston, Denver, Chicago, or maybe Texas? And be honest, what do you think happens next? Now let's go back to the beginning. Calvin Brooks adjusted his stethoscope as he locked up the veterinary clinic, the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. At 35, he had built something solid here in Atlanta, a thriving practice that served the community with genuine care. 3 years of marriage to Jasmine had given him the family he had always dreamed of, complete with a mother-in-law who treated him like the son she never had. The evening routine felt comfortable and predictable. Calvin's clinic generated steady income from a loyal client base who trusted him with their beloved pets. He took pride in the fact that families drove across town specifically to bring their animals to him. Word of mouth had built his reputation, one satisfied customer at a time, and the financial stability allowed him to provide well for his small family. As he walked toward his truck, Calvin mentally calculated the day's earnings. His phone buzzed as he started the engine. Jasmine's name flashed on the screen, and Calvin answered with his usual warmth. "Hey, beautiful. I'm heading home now. How was your day at the bank?" Jasmine worked as a loan officer at SunTrust, a position that kept her engaged with the community and provided additional financial security for their household. She seemed genuinely invested in their life together, always asking about his patients and remembering details about the animals he treated. "Calvin, baby, I'm still at work finishing up some paperwork, but I wanted to let you know Mom called," Jasmine said, her voice carrying the usual affection she had for both him and Dorothy. "She's making that pot roast you loved tonight. You know how she gets when she doesn't cook for her favorite son-in-law at least twice a week." Calvin chuckled, knowing that Dorothy's devotion to feeding him had become a running joke in their household. The older woman had embraced him completely from the moment they met, often telling her church friends that Calvin was the perfect son-in-law, the kind of man who treats my daughter like a queen. Dorothy's approval meant everything to Calvin, particularly since his own family had been distant and unsupportive throughout his life. In Dorothy, he had found the maternal figure he had always craved, someone who celebrated his successes and offered wisdom during difficult times. The drive home took him through familiar neighborhoods where he had built relationships with pet owners over the years. Calvin waved to Mrs. Henderson walking her German Shepherd and honked at the Martinez family whose cat he had successfully treated for diabetes. These connections gave his work meaning beyond the financial rewards. He had created something lasting here in Atlanta, something that mattered to real people and their families. When he pulled into their driveway, Calvin could see the warm glow of lights through their front windows. This was the life he had worked toward, stable, loving, and filled with people who appreciated his dedication. Jasmine's car was not yet in the driveway, which meant she was probably still at the bank handling the end-of-day responsibilities that often kept loan officers late. Dorothy's influence had helped Jasmine develop a strong work ethic. Inside, Calvin found evidence of the life they had built together over 3 years of marriage. Photos from their wedding, vacation souvenirs, small improvements they had made to turn their house into a real home. Everything reflected their shared commitment to building something lasting. Jasmine always made sure their space felt welcoming, while Calvin handled the practical matters that kept their household running smoothly. They had found a balance that worked perfectly. His phone rang again, and this time Dorothy's name appeared on the screen. Calvin smiled as he answered, expecting to hear about dinner plans or perhaps a request for him to pick up something from the store on his way over. Dorothy had a way of making even simple requests feel like opportunities for him to be helpful, and he genuinely enjoyed being needed by his extended family. "Calvin, honey, I need you to come over right now." Dorothy's voice carried through the phone, but something was different, something urgent and frightening that made his stomach drop immediately. "I just got back from the doctor, and baby, we need to talk. My kidney test came back, and they were saying I need a transplant immediately. Can you come now?" Calvin arrived at Dorothy's house within 15 minutes, his heart pounding as he knocked on the familiar front door. When Dorothy opened it, her face was streaked with tears, and she immediately pulled him into a tight embrace. "Oh, Calvin, I'm so scared," she whispered against his shoulder. "The doctor said my kidneys are failing fast. Without a transplant, I have maybe 6 months." Calvin held her steady, feeling the tremor in her hands as she gripped his arms. They sat in her living room where he had spent countless Sunday afternoons over the past 3 years. But tonight, everything felt different. Dorothy explained that her kidney function had dropped to less than 10%, and she needed to be placed on dialysis immediately while waiting for a transplant. "The waiting list is 3 to 5 years, she said, her voice breaking. "Most people my age don't make it that long." Calvin listened to every word, his mind already racing toward the obvious solution. "Test me," Calvin said without hesitation. "I'll donate one of my kidneys to you." Dorothy's eyes widened in shock and she shook her head vigorously. "Baby, no, I can't ask you to do that. The risks, the recovery time." Calvin took her hands in his, meeting her gaze with unwavering determination. "You're not asking. I'm offering. Your family, Dorothy. Real family. And family takes care of family, no matter what it tita." When Jasmine arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing her bank uniform, Calvin explained his decision. Her reaction was everything he had hoped for and more. Tears filled her eyes as she looked between Calvin and her mother, seemingly overwhelmed by his willingness to sacrifice for their family. "Calvin, are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have complications, permanent health issues. This is such a huge risk." "Your mother saved my life by accepting me into this family," Calvin replied, pulling Jasmine close. "This is my chance to save hers." Jasmine buried her face against his chest, and when she looked up, her eyes were shining with admiration. "You are the most wonderful man in the world," she whispered. "I don't know what we did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you are ours." Dorothy nodded through her tears, reaching out to squeeze Calvin's hand. The next week passed in a whirlwind of medical appointments and compatibility testing. Calvin underwent extensive blood work, tissue typing, and psychological evaluations to ensure he was a suitable donor candidate. Each test brought more good news. His blood type was a perfect match, his tissue compatibility was excellent, and his overall health was ideal for donation. "You're literally his mother's only hope," the transplant coordinator told Jasmine during one of their consultations. The financial reality of his decision began to sink in as Calvin arranged coverage for his veterinary practice. He would need to close the clinic for at least 2 months during his recovery, which meant losing approximately $40,000 in revenue. The timing was particularly difficult since they had been saving for a down payment on a larger house, and Calvin had planned to expand his practice with his second location. But watching Dorothy's grateful face during their pre-surgical meetings made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. "Calvin, I need you to understand what this means," Dorothy said during one of their final consultations before surgery. "You're literally giving me my life back. I'm going to see grandchildren someday because of what you're doing." She wiped her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're not just my son-in-law anymore. You're my son, my real son. I couldn't love you more if I had given birth to you myself." Calvin signed the final consent forms on a Thursday afternoon, officially committing to donate his kidney in a procedure scheduled for the following Monday. The surgeon explained the risks one last time: potential complications, permanent changes to his kidney function, and a recovery period that would require complete rest for several weeks. Calvin listened carefully but never wavered in his decision. This was what family meant, what love required when everything was on the line. The night before surgery, Calvin lay in bed reviewing the financial projections he had calculated for closing his practice. The numbers were daunting but manageable if he was careful with their savings. Jasmine was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, and Calvin could hear her talking on her phone. Her voice carried an unusually cheerful tone that seemed out of place given the gravity of tomorrow's surgery. When he listened more carefully, he caught fragments of conversation that made his stomach tighten with an inexplicable sense of unease. Monday morning arrived with the sterile efficiency of a hospital operating room. Calvin checked in at 5:30 in the morning, his stomach empty from the required fasting, his mind focused on the procedure ahead. Jasmine held his hand as they walked through the pre-operative preparation, her fingers warm against his skin. "I love you so much," she whispered as the nurses began their final checks. "You're doing something incredible today." The anesthesiologist explained the process while inserting the IV line into Calvin's arm. Within minutes, the world began to fade around the edges, and Calvin's last conscious thought was of Dorothy's grateful smile from the night before. As the medication took hold, his mind drifted backward through the memories that had brought him to this moment. He remembered meeting Jasmine 5 years ago at a community fundraiser, how her laugh had drawn his attention across the crowded room. Their courtship had been everything Calvin had dreamed of. Long conversations over coffee, weekend trips to nearby cities, quiet evenings cooking dinner together in his kitchen. Jasmine had been patient with his busy schedule at the veterinary clinic, understanding when emergency calls interrupted their plans. She had supported his decision to open his own practice, even helping him paint the waiting room on weekends. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, her tears of joy had convinced him he was making the right choice. The wedding had been small, but perfect, held in Dorothy's backyard with close friends and family. Calvin remembered dancing with his new wife under string lights while Dorothy watched from the porch, beaming with pride. Their honeymoon in Savannah had been magical. Long walks through historic districts, romantic dinners overlooking the river, late nights planning their future together. Those early months of marriage had felt like the culmination of everything Calvin had worked toward in his adult life. When Calvin began to regain consciousness several hours later, the first sensation was pain, a deep, throbbing ache along his left side where the surgeons had made their incision. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft voices of nurses checking on patients. Calvin tried to focus on the ceiling, tiles above him, waiting for the fog of anesthesia to clear from his mind. The procedure was over, which meant Dorothy was somewhere in this same hospital receiving his kidney. A nurse appeared beside his bed, checking his vital signs and adjusting his pain medication. "How are you feeling, Mr. Brooks?" she asked with professional kindness. "The surgery went perfectly. Dr. Martinez said everything looked great, and your kidney is already functioning beautifully in the recipient." Calvin managed a weak smile, relief washing over him despite the discomfort. Dorothy was going to be okay. The sacrifice had been worth every moment of pain he was experiencing now. "Where's my wife?" Calvin asked, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube. He expected to see Jasmine's concerned face, to feel her hand in his as he recovered from the most significant medical procedure of his life. The nurse glanced at the chair beside his bed, which was conspicuously empty. "She was here during the surgery, but she left about an hour ago," the nurse explained. "Said she had some important business to handle at home." Calvin felt a strange knot form in his stomach that had nothing to do with surgical pain. Important business? What could possibly be more important than being here when he woke up from donating a kidney to her mother? The nurse continued her routine checks, but Calvin's mind was no longer focused on his physical recovery. Something about Jasmine's absence felt wrong, inconsistent with the woman who had proclaimed him the most wonderful man in the world just days earlier. Over the next few hours, Calvin drifted in and out of consciousness, each time expecting to find Jasmine sitting beside his bed. Instead, he found only empty chairs and the concerned faces of medical staff. When Dorothy was wheeled past his room on her way to recovery, she managed to wave weakly through the doorway. Her color already looked better, and Calvin felt a surge of satisfaction knowing his decision had given her a new chance at life. By evening, Calvin was more alert but increasingly troubled by Jasmine's continued absence. When the night nurse came to check his medications, Calvin asked again about his wife's whereabouts. "She called around dinner time," the nurse said, consulting her notes. "Said she was handling some urgent work situation and would try to visit tomorrow." Calvin stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of urgent work situation could keep a wife away from her husband's hospital bedside on the day he donated a kidney to save her mother's life. By the 5th day after surgery, Calvin remained bedridden in his hospital room, his body still racked with pain from the kidney donation. The incision along his left side throbbed with every movement, and the doctors had warned him that full recovery would take several more weeks. He had barely been able to sit up without assistance, let alone stand or walk more than a few steps to the bathroom. The morphine drip helped manage the worst of the discomfort, but nothing could ease his growing concern about Jasmine's continued absence. Dorothy had visited twice since her own surgery, rolling her wheelchair into his room with tears of gratitude in her eyes. The transplanted kidney was functioning perfectly, and her color had already improved dramatically. "You saved my life, son," she had whispered during her last visit. "I will never forget what you sacrificed for our family." Calvin had smiled through his pain, believing that his decision had strengthened the bonds that held their small family together. The afternoon sun streamed through his hospital room window when Calvin heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. He turned his head expectantly, hoping to finally see Jasmine's familiar face after days of mysterious absences and vague excuses from the nursing staff. When the door opened, Jasmine did indeed step inside, but she was not alone. A tall black man with an expensive suit and confident smile entered beside her, their fingers intertwined in an unmistakably intimate way. Calvin's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man from Jasmine's bank Christmas party 6 months earlier. Darnell Washington, a senior loan officer who had charmed everyone at the event with his smooth conversation and obvious success. Calvin had thought nothing of their professional relationship at the time, trusting completely in his wife's commitment to their marriage. Now, seeing them together in his hospital room while he lay helpless and recovering, Calvin felt reality shift beneath him like quicksand. "Calvin," Jasmine said, her voice carrying none of the warmth he had grown accustomed to over 5 years together. "We need to talk." She moved to stand at the foot of his hospital bed, still holding Darnell's hand, her expression cold and businesslike. Calvin tried to sit up straighter despite the shooting pain in his side, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. This could not be happening. Not here, not now, not after what he had just sacrificed for her family. "Darnell and I have been seeing each other for 8 months, Jasmine continued, with devastating calmness. "We're in love, and I'm filing for divorce as soon as you're released from the hospital." The words hit Calvin like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into his consciousness than any surgical pain he had endured. 8 months. While he had been planning their future, saving money for a larger house, working extra hours to provide stability for their family, Jasmine had been building a completely different life with another man. Darnell stepped forward with a smile that was both grateful and mocking. "Calvin, man, I want to thank you personally for donating that kidney," he said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "Dorothy is going to be my mother-in-law soon, so in a way, you saved my future family member. I really appreciate that sacrifice." Calvin stared at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend the casual cruelty of those words. Everything he had done, every sacrifice he had made, had been manipulated to serve their selfish agenda. "You used me," Calvin whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of medical equipment beeping around them. "You both used me. You waited until I gave Dorothy my kidney, and now you think you can just discard me like garbage." Jasmine's expression remained unmoved, as if she were discussing a routine business transaction rather than the destruction of a marriage that had meant everything to Calvin. "It wasn't personal, Calvin," Jasmine replied with chilling detachment. "You're a good man, but Darnell can provide things for me that you never could. He's being promoted to regional manager next month, and we've already put a down payment on a house in Buckhead. I need someone who can give me the lifestyle I deserve." Calvin felt nausea wash over him that had nothing to do with post-surgical recovery. Jasmine reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, which she dropped onto Calvin's hospital bed. "The divorce papers are inside," she said coldly. "My lawyer says this should be quick and simple." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that cut through Calvin's shock like a blade. "Sign them, Calvin. You don't have any choice in this matter anymore." Before Calvin could respond to Jasmine's ultimatum, the hospital room door opened again. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, no longer in her wheelchair, but walking slowly with the aid of a walker. Calvin's heart lifted momentarily, expecting his mother-in-law to express shock and outrage at the scene unfolding before her. Instead, Dorothy's face showed no surprise whatsoever. "Hello, Calvin," she said calmly, moving into the room with Darnell's assistance. "I see Jasmine has finally told you the truth. It's about time." Calvin stared at her in disbelief, his world continuing to crumble with each passing second. "You knew," Calvin whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. "You knew about this the whole time." Dorothy settled into the visitor's chair beside his bed, her expression showing not even a trace of guilt or shame. "Of course I knew, baby," she said with casual indifference. "You think my daughter could hide something this important from me? Darnell has been part of our family for months. He's the one who's been helping with my medical bills, paying for the specialist appointments that led to your kidney donation." Calvin felt his heart breaking in ways he had never imagined possible. "Darnell makes 3 times what you make at that little animal clinic," Dorothy continued matter-of-factly. "He can provide for Jasmine in ways you never could. He's a real man with real money. not someone playing doctor with sick cats and dogs. The cruelty in her voice was like nothing Calvin had ever heard from the woman he had considered a mother. "But I gave you my kidney," Calvin said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I sacrificed everything for you. I closed my practice, lost thousands of dollars, went through major surgery because I thought we were family." Dorothy's expression hardened into something cold and dismissive. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on the tone she might use with an unwelcome solicitor. "Listen to me carefully, Calvin," Dorothy said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You donated your kidney because that was your obligation. That's what you were supposed to do for family. But now that obligation is finished." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Now you need to disappear and stop bothering my family. We don't need you anymore." Darnell stepped forward with obvious pride, pulling out his phone to show Calvin photos of an impressive house with manicured landscaping. "This is where my ladies are going to be living," he said with satisfaction. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, swimming pool in the backyard. Dorothy's going to have her own suite with a private entrance, and Jasmine's getting the master bedroom she deserves. No more worrying about medical bills or living paycheck to paycheck. The conversation had grown louder, and Calvin realized that other patients and visitors in the hallway were beginning to stop and listen. His humiliation was becoming a public spectacle, played out in front of strangers who were witnessing his complete destruction. Dorothy seemed to notice the audience and raised her voice deliberately, as if she wanted everyone to hear what came next. "You served your purpose, Calvin," Dorothy announced loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear clearly. "You gave me what I needed to survive, and now it's time for you to get out of our lives permanently. Don't call us, don't visit us, and don't pretend you're still part of this family. We have a real future to build now, and you're not part of it." Calvin could see faces peering into his room from the hallway, some shocked by the cruelty they were witnessing, others merely curious about the drama unfolding before them. Jasmine gathered the divorce papers from his bedside table, her movements brisk and businesslike. "We'll expect these signed and returned within a week," she said without making eye contact. The 3 of them moved toward the door, leaving Calvin alone with his shame and the staring faces of strangers. As they reached the threshold, Dorothy turned back for one final humiliation. "And remember what I said about not contacting us," she called out, ensuring that everyone in the corridor heard her words. "You're nobody to us now." Their footsteps receded down the hallway, followed by whispered conversations among the people who had witnessed Calvin's public destruction. Calvin lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, while the reality of his situation settled over him. The sound of approaching footsteps made him close his eyes, unwilling to face more curious stares. When the footsteps stopped at his doorway, Calvin opened his eyes to see Dr. Williams, his surgeon, standing there with a serious expression. Williams stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his expression shifting from professional concern to something more personal. "Calvin, I couldn't help but overhear what just happened," he said quietly. "I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, and I've never witnessed anything quite that cruel. Are you going to be okay?" Calvin managed a weak nod, though they both knew the question was impossible to answer honestly. "I need to ask you something as your surgeon," Dr. Williams continued. "Do you have someone who can help you through the next few weeks? Family members? Close friends? Recovery from kidney donation requires support, both physical and emotional. What I just witnessed suggests you're going to be handling this alone." Calvin realized that the doctor was right. He had no one left. His biological family lived across the country and had never been particularly close. After Dr. Williams left with promises to check on him later, Calvin found himself staring at the ceiling in complete silence. The morphine was beginning to wear off, and the physical pain was returning with a vengeance. But worse than the surgical discomfort was the crushing realization that everything he had built over the past 5 years was gone. His marriage, his extended family, his sense of purpose, all of it had been an elaborate deception. Calvin reached for his phone on the bedside table, wincing at the sharp pain that shot through his incision. If Jasmine was serious about divorce proceedings, he needed to understand his financial situation and protect whatever assets he could. Calvin opened his banking app and began scrolling through his accounts methodically. His primary checking account, his business account for the veterinary practice, the small savings account they had been building for their future home. As he continued reviewing his finances, Calvin remembered an old investment account he had not checked in years. His father had left him a modest inheritance when Calvin was in veterinary school, some stock in a technology company that had seemed worthless at the time. Calvin had been so focused on building his practice in his marriage that he had completely forgotten about those shares. He searched through his old email accounts until he found the login information. When Calvin accessed the investment account, he stared at the screen in disbelief. The technology company his father had invested in was now one of the leading developers of artificial intelligence software. The stock price had increased dramatically over the past 8 years as the company grew from a small startup to a major corporation. Calvin refreshed the page several times, certain he was reading the numbers incorrectly. The account balance showed $2,100,000. Calvin's hands began to shake as he calculated the return on his father's original investment. The shares had increased in value by nearly 2,000% since his father's death. What had started as a modest inheritance of $10,000 in seemingly worthless technology stock had grown into a fortune that Calvin had never even known he possessed. Calvin set his phone down and stared at the hospital room wall, his mind racing through the implications of this discovery. Jasmine had no knowledge of this account because it predated their marriage by several years. Under Georgia law, assets acquired before marriage typically remain the separate property of the individual spouse. This money was his alone, completely protected from any divorce settlement Jasmine might pursue. The irony was almost overwhelming. While Jasmine and Dorothy had been calculating how to extract maximum benefit from their relationship with Calvin, they had discarded him just as he discovered he was worth more than Darnell's banking salary could provide in a lifetime. Calvin thought about Darnell's boasting about the house in Buckhead, Dorothy's excitement about financial security, Jasmine's desire for a lifestyle upgrade, all of it meaningless compared to what Calvin now controlled. Calvin picked up his phone again and called his old college roommate, Marcus Freeman, who had become a successful divorce attorney in Atlanta. When Marcus answered, Calvin could hear the concern in his friend's voice. "Calvin, man, I heard you were in the hospital. How are you holding up?" Calvin briefly explained the kidney donation and then, in carefully measured words, described the betrayal he had just experienced. "I need legal representation for a divorce," Calvin said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And Marcus, there are some financial considerations we need to discuss privately." Marcus agreed to visit the hospital the following day to review Calvin's situation. As Calvin ended the call, he felt something he had not experienced since walking into his hospital room 5 days earlier: control. For the first time since Jasmine had walked through his door holding another man's hand, Calvin allowed himself to smile. They thought they had used him completely, extracted everything of value and discarded him like garbage. But they had made one critical error in their calculations. They had never bothered to learn everything about the man they were betraying. Marcus Freeman arrived at the hospital the next morning carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the confident expression of a man who had handled hundreds of complex divorce cases. Calvin's college roommate had built his reputation on protecting clients' assets during high-stakes separations, and his presence immediately gave Calvin a sense of hope he had not felt in days. Marcus pulled up a chair beside Calvin's bed and opened his notepad with practiced efficiency. "Tell me everything," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with betrayal and deception. Calvin recounted the entire situation, from the kidney donation through the hospital room confrontation, while Marcus took detailed notes. When Calvin mentioned the investment account discovery, Marcus raised an eyebrow and leaned forward with obvious interest. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus asked quietly. $2.1 million, Calvin replied, watching his friend's expression shift from concern to strategic calculation. Marcus set down his pen and looked directly at Calvin. Under Georgia law, assets acquired before marriage remain separate property unless they've been commingled with marital funds. If you can prove this account existed before your marriage and was never mixed with joint assets, it's completely protected from division. Marcus spent the next hour reviewing Calvin's financial records on his phone, confirming that the investment account had remained entirely separate from any marital assets. Calvin had never mentioned it to Jasmine, never transferred money between accounts, never used those funds for any shared expenses. "She has no legal claim to any of this," Marcus confirmed with satisfaction. "Not a single penny." "But here's where it gets interesting," Marcus continued, his tone shifting to something more strategic. You could liquidate some of these shares and use the capital for investments that might give you additional leverage in this situation. What does Jasmine's boyfriend do again? Calvin explained Darnell's position at SunTrust Bank, and Marcus began typing notes into his phone. Regional banks are always looking for private investment capital. This could be very useful. Over the next 2 days, while Calvin recovered from surgery, Marcus conducted discreet research into SunTrust Bank's financial situation. He discovered that the bank was indeed seeking private investors to fund an expansion into commercial lending. More importantly, Marcus learned that Darnell's promotion to regional manager was contingent on his ability to bring in new business and maintain existing client relationships. Any disruption to the bank's stability could jeopardize his career advancement. "I have an idea," Marcus said during his second visit. "What if you became a major investor in Jasmine's workplace? Anonymous, of course, through a shell corporation I can establish for you. You'd have access to internal information, board meeting minutes, employee performance reviews. You could monitor their activities without them having any idea who's watching." Calvin felt a surge of anticipation as he understood the implications of Marcus's suggestion. Marcus explained how they could structure the investment through a limited liability company that would obscure Calvin's identity while giving him significant influence over bank operations. "Private equity firms do this all the time," Marcus said. "You invest $500,000, which gives you about 15% ownership in a regional bank this size, enough to have a voice in major decisions, enough to access confidential information about employee conduct." Calvin authorized Marcus to begin the process immediately. While his body healed from surgery, his mind was already planning several steps ahead. The same bank where Jasmine worked, where she had met Darnell, where they had presumably conducted their 8-month affair under the noses of management, would now be partially under Calvin's control. The irony was almost poetic. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said as he prepared to leave that afternoon. "I've been asking around about Darnell Washington. Apparently his promotion isn't as secure as he's been telling people. There have been some questions about his expense reports, some irregularities in client account management. Nothing proven yet, but the kind of red flags that make banks nervous about promoting people to senior positions." Calvin absorbed this information with growing satisfaction. While Jasmine and Darnell had been planning their future based on his expected promotion and increased salary, they had been building their dreams on potentially unstable foundations. Calvin's investment in the bank would give him access to personnel files, financial records, and internal investigations that might reveal exactly how unstable those foundations really were. On Calvin's final day in the hospital, Marcus returned with completed paperwork establishing Brooks Capital Management, LLC, and confirming Calvin's substantial investment in SunTrust Bank. "The bank's board has approved your investment," Marcus reported. "You're now a 15% owner, with full access to board meetings and quarterly reports. Your first board meeting is next month." Calvin signed his discharge papers with a sense of anticipation he had not felt since before his surgery. His physical recovery would take several more weeks, but his strategic planning was already complete. As the nurse wheeled him toward the hospital exit, Calvin thought about Jasmine sitting at her desk at SunTrust, completely unaware that her discarded husband was now her boss's boss. The real game was just beginning. 2 weeks after his discharge, Calvin arranged to meet Jasmine at Marcus's law office. He deliberately appeared weak and defeated, wearing loose clothes that emphasized his weight loss and moving slowly to highlight his recovery. When Jasmine and Darnell arrived with a bargain attorney from a strip mall practice, Calvin could see their confidence as they assumed they were dealing with a broken man. "Thank you for coming," Marcus began professionally. "My client is prepared to discuss asset division." Calvin slouched in his chair, playing the role of a thoroughly defeated man who simply wanted the ordeal to end quickly. Jasmine's attorney, a nervous man named Henderson, opened a thin file and began reading from a handwritten list. "Mrs. Brooks is seeking 50% ownership of the veterinary practice, including all equipment and client lists," Henderson announced. "She's also requesting spousal support for 3 years. Calvin exchanged a look with Marcus before responding in a deliberately weakened voice. "I don't want to fight anymore," he said quietly. "If giving her half the practice means I can move on, then that's what I'll do." Darnell leaned forward, unable to contain his smugness. "This isn't personal, Calvin," he said with false sincerity. "Jasmine and I are planning to marry next spring and expand the practice into a full animal hospital. Your work won't be wasted." Calvin nodded weakly, as if grateful for Darnell's reassurance about his life's work. We've already put a deposit down on the perfect location, Jasmine added excitedly. A beautiful building near Piedmont Park. Darnell's promotion to regional manager means we can really invest in making this business special. Calvin made mental notes while maintaining his facade of resigned acceptance. Marcus spent an hour drafting terms that seemed favorable to Jasmine while actually protecting Calvin's valuable assets. The investment account remained hidden, his bank ownership was never mentioned, and Calvin appeared to surrender his modest practice to his betrayer. Henderson seemed pleased with what he perceived as an easy victory. Calvin's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his SunTrust board position. The quarterly financial review was available. "Excuse me," Calvin said weakly, standing with apparent difficulty. "I need to take some medication." He stepped into the hallway and accessed the banking portal on his phone, reviewing SunTrust's internal records. As a board member, Calvin now had access to detailed transaction reports and employee account monitoring. What he discovered made his pulse quicken. Darnell's banking activity showed large cash deposits that didn't match his documented salary, along with transfers violating bank policy regarding employee accounts. Calvin found a pattern suggesting Darnell had been temporarily borrowing money from dormant client accounts, using funds for personal expenses, then replacing money before audits. This was technically fraud, even if money was eventually returned, representing exactly the behavior that could destroy a banking career. When Calvin returned, Darnell was showing Jasmine photos of their Buckhead house. "The closing was Friday," Darnell announced proudly. "Cash purchase, no mortgage needed. I've been saving for years." Calvin listened carefully, knowing Darnell's salary history could never have generated savings for a cash purchase of a $400,000 house. Marcus scheduled a follow-up to finalize divorce paperwork. As they prepared to leave, Jasmine and Darnell seemed giddy with success. "Calvin, I hope you understand this is for the best," Jasmine said with mock sympathy. "You'll be happier with something smaller, more suited to your limitations." Calvin nodded gratefully, appreciating her concern. After they left, Marcus closed the door and looked at Calvin admiringly. "Masterful performance," he said. "They have no idea what's coming." Calvin showed Marcus the banking records. "Look at these transaction dates," Calvin said quietly. "Darnell's been stealing from client accounts to fund his lifestyle." Marcus studied the data with prosecutorial focus. "This is federal banking fraud," he said slowly. "If we can prove he used stolen money for that house," Calvin finished with his first genuine smile in weeks, "then everything they think they've won disappears overnight." His phone buzzed again. The compliance department had flagged Darnell's account, discovering he had taken $150,000 from customer accounts. Calvin contacted the FBI Financial Crimes Unit the next morning, providing detailed evidence of Darnell's embezzlement activities. The federal agents were particularly interested in the pattern of unauthorized transfers in the cash house purchase that exceeded Darnell's legitimate income capacity. Within 72 hours, they had obtained warrants for Darnell's arrest and asset seizure. Thursday afternoon, as Jasmine sat at her desk processing loan applications, federal agents walked into SunTrust Bank and approached Darnell's office. Calvin watched the scene unfold through the bank's security cameras, his new board member access allowing him to monitor the situation in real time. Darnell was handcuffed in front of his colleagues and escorted from the building while Jasmine screamed his name in shock. The news spread through the bank instantly. Darnell Washington, the rising star who had seemed destined for regional management, was being charged with federal banking fraud and embezzlement of customer funds totaling $150,000. Jasmine collapsed in her chair as she realized that everything Darnell had promised her was built on stolen money. Within hours, federal marshals arrived at the Buckhead house with seizure orders. The beautiful four-bedroom home that was supposed to represent Jasmine and Dorothy's new life was now evidence in a federal criminal case. Dorothy, who had been living in the master suite for only 2 weeks, was forced to pack her belongings and find alternative housing. Without Darnell's income and with the house seized, Dorothy could no longer afford her private medical insurance. Calvin received a call from Dorothy's hospital that evening. Her kidney function was stable, but she needed to transfer to a county facility because she could no longer pay for private care. "Mr. Brooks," the social worker explained, "Mrs. Dorothy listed you as emergency contact. She's asking if you might help with her medical expenses." Calvin listened politely before declining to provide any assistance. The next morning, Calvin arrived at SunTrust Bank for an unscheduled board meeting. As the newly revealed 15% owner, He had called for an immediate review of employee conduct policies and personnel decisions related to the embezzlement scandal. Jasmine was summoned to the conference room, expecting to discuss her knowledge of Darnell's activities. When Jasmine entered the conference room and saw Calvin sitting at the head of the table, her face went completely white. "Calvin?" she whispered in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Calvin looked up from his paperwork with calm professionalism. "I'm here as a member of this bank's board of directors," he said quietly. "I'm also your new boss." The bank president explained that Brooks Capital Management had become a major investor in SunTrust, giving Calvin significant oversight authority. "We're conducting a comprehensive review of all employees who had close relationships with Mr. Washington," the president continued. "Given your personal involvement with the suspect, we're terminating your employment immediately." Jasmine stared at Calvin in shock as the reality of her situation became clear. Her boyfriend was facing federal prison time. Her house had been seized by the government. Her mother was being transferred to charity care, and she had just lost her job. "Calvin, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I know we hurt you, but Dorothy needs help. She's going to die without proper medical care." Calvin gathered his papers and stood up from the conference table. "Mrs. Brooks," he said with formal politeness, "your employment with this bank is terminated. Security will escort you from the building." As Jasmine began to cry, Calvin added quietly, "And regarding your mother's medical situation, I'm sure you'll find a way to manage. After all, you told me that family takes care of family." Over the following weeks, Calvin learned through Marcus that Jasmine was unable to find new employment in Atlanta's tight-knit banking community. Her association with Darnell's fraud case made her unemployable in financial services, and her lack of other professional experience limited her options to minimum wage positions. Dorothy's health deteriorated rapidly in the underfunded county facility. 3 months after Darnell's arrest, Jasmine appeared at Calvin's veterinary clinic. She looked exhausted and desperate, her designer clothes replaced by discount store alternatives. Calvin watched through his office window as she waited in the parking lot for hours. When he finally agreed to see her, Jasmine fell to her knees and begged for mercy. "Calvin, please," she sobbed. "I know what we did was unforgivable. But Mom is dying, and I can't save her alone. I'll do anything, sign anything, give you anything you want. Please help us." Calvin looked down at the woman who had once dismissed him as inadequate, who had used his sacrifice for her own gain. "It's too late, Jasmine," he said simply, walking past her toward his truck. 6 months later, Calvin stood in Brooks Veterinary Center, his new clinic 3 times larger than his previous practice. The modern facility featured state-of-the-art surgical suites and emergency care wings. Calvin had used his investment returns to create something reflecting his true capabilities rather than the modest operation he had previously accepted. The clinic's success exceeded Calvin's projections. He had also established the Brooks Foundation, providing financial assistance to organ donors facing medical hardship during recovery. The foundation had already helped dozens of kidney donors struggling with expenses. Calvin made monthly visits to Mercy General's long-term care facility, where Dorothy resided in the charity ward. Her kidney function remained stable thanks to his donation, but her living conditions contrasted starkly with Darnell's promised luxury. During visits, Dorothy was polite but subdued, understanding her actions had permanent consequences. "Calvin," Dorothy said during his recent visit, "I know I don't deserve your kindness. I think about what we did every day." Calvin nodded without offering forgiveness. His visits ensured proper medical monitoring while maintaining boundaries. Marcus had seen Jasmine working as a server at a chain restaurant downtown. The woman who once demanded lifestyle upgrades now struggled with studio apartment rent. Her association with Darnell's fraud case made her unemployable professionally, forcing her to rebuild from minimum wage. The most significant change was meeting Angela Thomas, an obstetrician who brought her injured rescue dog to his clinic. Angela possessed genuine compassion for patients that Calvin felt for animals. Unlike his previous relationship, Calvin approached this connection with wisdom gained from experience. "You really see each animal as an individual," Angela said during evening walks through Piedmont Park. Calvin appreciated that Angela understood his calling without needing explanation. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect rather than desperation. Angela valued him for who he was presently rather than what he could provide. Standing in his clinic's examination room on a quiet Sunday evening, Calvin reflected on his journey. The betrayal that nearly destroyed him had revealed his true worth. He had learned to value himself appropriately, and expect genuine love rather than accepting mere appreciation for sacrifices. Calvin looked around the clinic representing his independence, thought about the foundation honoring his generosity, and considered the relationship celebrating his authentic self. For the first time, he had built something entirely on his own terms. This time, Calvin said quietly, I choose myself. Calvin's story reminds us that genuine kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that our greatest acts of love must begin with loving ourselves. True family doesn't exploit your generosity, they cherish it. When people show you who they really are through their actions, believe them the first time. Your worth isn't determined by how much you're willing to sacrifice for others, but by how much you're willing to stand up for yourself. If this story moved you, please hit the like button to help others find this message. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next video with another powerful story of resilience and redemption.